listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Marie Murphy. This podcast is all about expanding the conversation around infidelity. I'm a relationship coach, and I specialize in helping people who are cheating on their partners make decisions about how to move forward that are truly right for them. If you want to learn more about my work or schedule a coaching session with me, you can go to my website, mariemurphyphd.com. On this podcast, we feature tools and guidance from my coaching practice, as well as advice from other professionals whose work pertains to the sometimes complicated business of human romantic relationships. And today, we are going to talk about commitments. Commitments, as you may have noticed, are often celebrated in our society. We talk about how great it is to commit to something, anything, whether it's to a marriage or to running a marathon or to a professional goal or even to a change in our eating habits or to quitting smoking. We talk about the importance of sticking with something when it gets hard. We talk about never giving up. We vilify quitters, and so on and so on. And I am all in favor of tenacity. I believe that there is so much richness in the effort it takes to stick with something that matters to you when it's hard and confusing and unglamorous. In addition to that, I believe that there is great freedom in commitment. Ironically, even as we rush to celebrate commitment, we also sometimes shy away from it because we think it means we'll relinquish some of our options. And of course, this is true. We will relinquish some of our options by committing to one course of action over another. But that's true whether we make a commitment or not, because making a commitment doesn't just close off options. It also has the effect of opening up a whole set of possibilities that wouldn't otherwise be available to us. So all of this is to say that I think commitments can be great. However, here's the but. I also think that we as a society sometimes over-glorify and fetishize commitments in ways that are not always helpful. There are many instances in which we tend to prioritize following through on a commitment over all else, as if fulfilling a commitment is an inherently good thing in and of itself, no matter what the commitment is, and no matter the collateral damage in our lives. Now, the most common examples of this that I see in my coaching practice is with people who are married but are unhappy in their marriage. On the one hand, they believe that it's really important for them to follow through on the commitment they made to stay with their spouse for the rest of their lives, till death do them part. But on the other hand, they're deeply unsatisfied with their relationship, sometimes after many attempts to make changes in the relationship, and they're yearning for happiness. And for many people, this kind of a situation feels like an existential conundrum because they believe that commitments require a willingness to stick it out when the going gets tough. They recognize that many of life's most worthwhile endeavors are challenging and even unpleasant at times. But they're also sick of their unhappiness. They're sick of feeling stuck in a situation they'd rather not be in. And they're ready to feel like they're free to enjoy their lives and feel like they're truly living. So I think it's important to say that in addition, this is what I believe, in addition to honoring the fact that sticking with a commitment isn't always easy, and recognizing the payoff that can come from hanging in there when the going gets tough, we also need to have more and better conversations about how to know when to hold them and when to fold them. I think we need to find ways of allowing ourselves and others to evaluate our commitments, both the ones that we're considering making and the ones we've already made, with more honesty and with more options on the table. I think we need to have better conversations about what we can do when we start to realize that maybe we've made a commitment to something that we don't want to be committed to anymore. I think we need to have more conversations about how we can extricate ourselves from commitments we've made without equating this as failure or equating this with failure. And I think we need to talk, I think we need to talk more about how we can figure out what we want to do when staying committed to something we care about gets really hard. How hard is too hard? How unhappy or unsatisfied is too unhappy or unsatisfied? How long is it reasonable for a stretch of unhappiness or dissatisfaction within a commitment to last? How long is too long for such a stretch to last? I don't think that there are any easy answers to these questions, and I'm certainly not going to offer you any prescriptive advice today. But I think that simply putting these questions on the table for consideration in a new way would do us all a lot of good. And so, with that goal in mind, today I'm going to share a story of an existential conundrum I experienced in relation to a commitment I thought I'd made for life. Ready? Ready. Some young women fantasize about what their wedding dress will look like. I, on the other hand, daydreamed about what my academic regalia would look like. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me tell you. Upon graduation from a doctoral program, you don't just get to wear a regular cap and gown to your graduation. You get a special, I'm a full member of the cult cap and gown that's kind of like a wizard suit. Every institution's is a little different, and I always hoped that I would get my PhD from a university with a cool one, because if you remain in academia, you will wear your wizard suit to future graduation ceremonies where you give your students their diplomas and wish the next generation of scholars well as you send them off into the world. And that was the life that I had imagined for myself. I didn't want babies, dear listener. I wanted students. When I was in high school, or maybe when I was about 6, I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD in sociology. The process by which this decision was made is another story entirely, but decide I did. For better or worse, studying sociology as an undergraduate cemented this decision, and I spent the next however many years of my life with the goal of graduate school and a career in academia as my plan for how my life was going to go. And I hung on to this plan with ferocious tenacity throughout the course of significant experiences and adventures that might have prompted a more reasonable person to change their mind, or at the very least, consider alternate career paths. After I finished my undergraduate degree, I worked in academic administration for a little while. Then I served in the Peace Corps in Zambia for 3.5 years. I worked in international reproductive health, and I had a 6-month stint at Starbucks somewhere in the midst of all that. In other words, I had plenty of opportunities to come up with a different vision for my professional future, but I didn't. So when I finally got to graduate school, I started my PhD program with great enthusiasm. I worked my butt off the first year, and that hard work, combined with the novelty of the situation, combined with the seduction of sociological theory, combined with the high of feeling like I had achieved my big goal and I was on my way to the life I had envisioned for myself, kept me from ever really checking in to ask myself how I was doing and feeling. And besides, how could I stop to think about my feelings when I had so much goddamn reading to do? I couldn't. I don't remember the exact moment when I first realized how miserable I was, but it was sometime during the first quarter of my second year in the PhD program. Side note, a PhD in the social sciences usually takes about 6 to 8 years, so year 2 was just the beginning. End of side note. In a way, there was little denying the reality of my situation. I was drowning in my own unhappiness. I remember going out to dinner with my spouse during the winter break of that second year in the program, and being so consumed by my angst that I could barely utter a word, much less engage in anything resembling an actual conversation. Another side note, this happened far more than once. End of side note. But on the other hand, I had no idea what to do with these kinds of feelings. I thought that misery was an inherent and perhaps even important part of the graduate school experience. Wasn't it the whole point to be miserable? This was hard work. It wasn't supposed to be fun. Everyone around me, graduate students and faculty alike, wore their workloads like badges of honor. The idea, as far as I could tell, was that we'd all agreed that the sociological enterprise was the most important thing a person could possibly be involved in, and thus all of the hard work for low pay was noble and inherently worthwhile, even if it wasn't necessarily enjoyable, or pleasant. On the one hand, as sad as this might sound in retrospect, I was okay with this at the time. I was okay with the idea of hard work for low pay. But I thought I was going to find satisfaction and even joy in my work. A little struggle was to be expected, sure, but abject misery? I didn't want to experience that. And yet I was, and I had no idea what to do about it. I knew I could quit the doctoral program, of course. I could walk away at the end of year 2 with a master's degree. People did it all the time. But if I were to do that, I would have had to let go of the vision of my life that I'd been clinging to like ballast for at least a decade. And I had no idea how to do that. Who would I be outside of this rigid plan I'd laid out for myself? I didn't know, and I didn't have the faintest idea of how I might approach the task of finding out either. So I made quitting the program a non-option. But even if I couldn't give myself permission to fully examine my feelings of discontent or seriously consider quitting sociology, I knew I had to do something about my state of extreme unhappiness. So I enrolled in another course of study, a holistic health practitioner program. My interest in quote unquote alternative health had been growing for years, but I hadn't let myself consider it as a career interest. Pursuing training in holistic health allowed me to nurture those interests, which, in my crazy logic, allowed me to not have to reckon with my discontent in academia. With a lot of careful schedule juggling, I was able to fully engage in both programs at once, and this seemed like a reasonable compromise of sorts at the time. So, as a result, for a few years, I was teaching sociology to undergraduates, developing my own research projects, studying holistic health, and working in a massage therapy center for a few shifts a week. And then I started teaching yoga too. My schedule was full, in other words. And as a result, I was basically too busy to think. And that was sort of the point. On the one hand, juggling these various disparate pursuits was hard, but on the other hand, it was a lot easier to propel myself down this frenzied path and to ask myself the questions I really needed to ask myself about what I wanted out of my work life. I just focused on getting through the next quarter and achieving the next round of milestones instead. I had no idea what I wanted to come out of all of my parallel courses of work and study. And I justified my willful not knowing by saying that I had a few more years before I would complete the PhD. For a while, it was possible for me to keep telling myself that I could simply wait until the next year to figure things out. Now, for the record, I don't think there's anything wrong with not knowing exactly what you want to do in the future and letting the answers come to you in their own time. But I was doing something different. I was trying to resolve important questions by ignoring them, believing that if I just waited long enough, something would happen and my big questions would resolve themselves on their own. The essence of the problem is this. I believe that I had to continue doing something, namely sociology, that I had committed to, even if I'd only made that commitment to myself. Sure, I'd made a commitment to my department, but it wasn't like a, blood contract or anything like that. The problem was that I didn't know how to allow myself to end this commitment, and I didn't know how to give myself permission to change. If I'd hated everything about sociology, things might have been a lot different, but I didn't. In fact, there were many aspects of the sociological enterprise that I believed in with the fervor of a religious fanatic. I believed in the importance of teaching undergraduates about sexuality and gender and social inequalities. I believed in the importance of rigorous empirical inquiry into the social world. My dissertation research about the production of knowledge about sexuality in medical education mattered a lot to me. I believed the world needed sociology, and I believed the world needed sociologists. The problem, however, was that I didn't enjoy much of the day-to-day labor that goes into being a sociologist. The abject misery that I'd experienced during my second year in the program had abated, but I still wasn't finding the satisfaction I desired, or at least not to the extent that I desired it. When I taught my own sociology class for the first time, I discovered that I absolutely hated the labor that went into lecturing. And I do mean hated. Instead of taking those feelings seriously, though, I told myself that I only hated it because I was new at it, and I forced myself to do it again, thinking that it would get better over time. It didn't. I liked doing research, but I didn't love it, and I certainly didn't find the snout-to-tail business of a research project particularly satisfying, and I definitely didn't enjoy writing grants. In retrospect, it's easy to see that I was discovering that I liked the idea of doing sociology a lot more than I liked the actual doing of it. But I didn't know how to say that to myself at the time. At the time, I just thought that I needed to do a better job of hanging in there. I believed, on the one hand, that some things that are worthwhile and wonderful are really hard in the beginning. I firmly believe that anything worth being good at was also worth being bad at, or at least in the beginning, at least for a little while. Oh no, that's what I meant to say was, at least being a beginner at something was difficult, at least for a little while. I knew that some things are well worth doing can be really hard, especially at first. And I was afraid that if I didn't hang in there through the early days, the tough times, I'd never get to experience what I thought I was after in the first place. If it sounds like I was a crazy person going around and around in circles for months upon years, I was. But I was also seeking out all kinds of help in an effort to resolve my nagging, endless doubts and questions. I went to campus counseling services, thinking that the university psychologist would be very familiar with the sort of graduate student angst I was experiencing. Not so much. I tried our career center's questioning career transitions workshop for graduate students who weren't sure they wanted to pursue jobs in academia. To my great disappointment, I found it completely useless. I asked for and received advice from various people outside of academia, most of whom thought I was nuts, albeit for different reasons. Some had no idea why I didn't just quit my program. Why all the drama around the decision? Others couldn't believe that I was making such a big deal over the few more years it would take to complete the program. Then you'll be done and you'll have a PhD, they would say, as if having a PhD was inherently universally valuable, and once I had it, all of my problems would be solved. Others couldn't understand why anyone would want a PhD in sociology in the first place. Now, advice can be great, but it's no substitute for learning how to examine your own beliefs about your situation, learning how to digest your own feelings, and learning how to make decisions that are truly right for you. And I had no idea how to do any of those things very well, and no idea where or how to begin to learn. Years later, I would recognize with unmistakable clarity that what I'd really needed at the time was a good life coach. But back then, I had no idea what a life coach was. And if somebody had told me that such a thing as a life coach existed, I probably would have thought the whole business sounded ridiculous. And I probably would have told them so, probably not very nicely. Funny how things turn out. So I carried on. I stayed in my PhD program. I continued my parallel course of work and study in the holistic health realm. And I continued hoping that some sort of answer about what I should be doing with my seemingly irreconcilable professional pursuits would magically present itself. I just hoped that by putting my head down and working hard, my confusion and discontent would find some sort of spontaneous resolution. Instead, as time wore on, it became clearer and clearer that my feelings about my academic endeavors were consistent and persistent. It was becoming increasingly evident that my hope that something would just change, that I'd crest some hill and everything would be different, or that I'd wake up one morning and find myself free of all of my doubts and dislikes, was not to be realized. What did happen, however, was that with each additional year I stayed in the PhD program, the more I believed that I couldn't quit and therefore had to finish. So, when I'd collected all of my dissertation research data and had nothing left to do but actually write the dissertation, the rubber officially met the road. I needed to double down or bow out of the whole thing entirely. At the time, I had also started up a holistic health private practice, offering clients sessions that combined yoga therapy with body work with spiritual coaching. I absolutely loved this work, but being an entrepreneur was completely new to me and also terrifying, and attempting to write my dissertation and nurture my fledgling business at the same time was completely untenable. My juggling act had survived a while, but it wasn't going to continue any longer. At the time, it was abundantly clear to me that I truly enjoyed my holistic health work. I loved it. There was no question about that. But the path forward in that domain seemed uncertain to me. I didn't know anything about being an entrepreneur, and all of the normal challenges associated with starting up a small business and starting a new holistic health private practice seemed scary and daunting to me. So, against the backdrop of that flavor and degree of uncertainty, finishing my dissertation and getting my PhD seemed like a comparatively sensible thing to do. It was easy for me to tell myself that I was doing the right thing, even if I didn't exactly believe it myself. So, sadly, I gave up the little office with the amazing view that I'd rented for seeing clients. I condensed my yoga teaching schedule, and I endeavored to finish my dissertation. And finish, I eventually did. And at that point, I could have quit sociology for good. I could have said, thanks for the degree, folks. Now I'm going to move on with my life. But I didn't. Instead, I upped the ante and began looking for a job that would allow me to put my sociological expertise to use in a fairly literal way. I believed on some crazy level that I owed it to my dissertation committee and the discipline of sociology and myself, and maybe even the whole world, to do this. And moreover, I wasn't sure what other options were open to me at that point. I believed, in some weird way, that by finishing my dissertation, I dug myself pretty deep into a particular hole, and I had no hope of digging my way out of it. I'd made my bed, and I was going to have to sleep in it, or so my thinking went. So I did find myself a job based on my sociological credentials, and it provided good enough work-life balance for me to pursue a minimalist version of my holistic health private practice on the side. I didn't have to face any of my fears about entrepreneurship, but I still got to teach yoga and see a few clients here and there. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd created a work life for myself that was okay enough for me to be happy. And I thought that maybe then the fulfillment of the commitment I'd made to sociology would pay off in satisfying fashion. Maybe now I had finally hung in there for long enough to reap the rewards of having stuck it out. Well, dear listener, if you've made it this far, if you're still listening, you know that this is not how the story ends. You're listening to my podcast on which I am speaking to you as a relationship coach. Not long after I landed the okay enough job in sociology that I thought was going to allow me to live an okay enough life, I realized that instead of reaping some miraculous reward for sticking with my commitment to sociology for so long, my own unhappiness had finally become unavoidable. My body forced me out of denial with physical symptoms I couldn't argue with. I gained 10 pounds in what seemed like an instant. I developed I developed back problems for the first time in my life. Getting out of bed in the mornings was suddenly impossible. I finally understood that I couldn't continue my strategy of sweeping my feelings under the rug with the hope that I'd feel better later. Only then did I finally realize how twisted the logic of my decision making or decision avoiding had been all along. I finally understood that I was going to I finally understood that I was going to have to face my feelings. I finally understood that I was going to have to grapple with a whole lot of uncertainty. I finally understood that trying to keep myself confined to a version of myself that I had imagined many years before for the sake of avoiding the inconvenience, quote unquote, of beginning anew and reinventing myself just wasn't going to work. I finally understood that there wasn't going to be some magic reward for sticking with sociology and sticking to the commitment I'd made. I finally understood that I was going to have to stop hoping that avoiding, denying, or ignoring my own unhappiness was going to be an effective strategy for just about anything. Now, the story of how I got from that particular moment in my life to where I am today is another tale for another time. But for our purposes today, what I want to emphasize to you is that even if the idea of quitting a PhD program doesn't sound like a big deal to you, there are a number of elements of my experience that show up in a lot of people's lives in one form or another. For instance, I had no idea how to grapple with the fact that in fulfilling a commitment that I had made earnestly and enthusiastically, I was miserable. I had no idea how to make sense of the possibility that the life I'd envisioned for myself might not be all that appealing to me, or even tolerable for that matter. I had no idea how to let myself change. I had no idea how to face my fears about what might happen if I let myself change. I had no idea how to make a decision about whether or not to extricate myself from a commitment I'd made in earnest. I had no idea how to figure out whether it was time for me to hold them or time for me to fold them. I didn't know how to decide whether it was time to walk away or time to run. I had no idea what kinds of commitments to myself might have been more important to make than any commitments I'd made to any external entity. I had no idea how much happiness I was allowed to have or even allowed to want. I had no idea how to give myself permission to release myself from my self-imposed prison of unhappiness. I had no idea that my prison of unhappiness was self-imposed. I had no idea that I'd unconsciously and unnecessarily wedded myself to a long list of constraints. Now, if this sounds tormented and awful, it kind of was for a while there. But the story doesn't end badly at all. My sociological training and expertise inform my approach to coaching in countless ways. My struggle to figure out what I wanted to do about my commitment to sociology eventually got me to the point of having a coaching practice that I love, and to the point of being able to deeply understand other people's struggles with commitments of all kinds. I have become the sort of help for other people that I desperately needed for myself, but couldn't find when I was a graduate student. It took me a little time, but eventually I learned how to alchemize experiences that seemed like nothing more than a load of lead into pure gold. All right, everybody, that's it for today. If you're enjoying this podcast, please head on over to iTunes to rate and review the show. Thank you so much for listening, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.